Welcome to the Global Risk Podcast from Solace Global. This is your weekly global intelligence briefing, covering the key geopolitical and security developments shaping the world. In the Americas, we look at the assassination of an anti-cartel mayor in Mexico, which has sparked widespread unrest and prompted the government to ramp up operations against organized crime. We also examine the United States' mixed messaging over potential airstrikes on Venezuela, a strategy likely designed to maintain pressure on the Maduro regime. In Europe, the Middle East and Africa, we assess the intensifying battle for Pokrovsk, where Ukrainian forces are struggling to hold back Russian advances. We also cover the worsening fuel crisis in Mali as Western governments urge citizens to evacuate, growing speculation over possible US airstrikes in Nigeria's Borno state, and the ongoing unrest in Cameroon and Tanzania following contested elections. And in Asia-Pacific, we look at the devastation caused by Typhoon Kalmaegi across the central Philippines and Vietnam, the latest in a series of disasters fueling anti-corruption protests and humanitarian strain across the region. Expert insight, clear analysis, and the context you need, all in one concise briefing. We begin in the Americas, where the assassination of an anti-cartel mayor in Mexico has ignited large-scale protests and a major government crackdown. On November 1st, the mayor of Uruapan, Carlos Manzo, was assassinated in a targeted attack during local Day of the Dead celebrations. Uruapan is the second largest city in Michoacán, a state that has experienced escalating violence in recent years as the Jalisco New Generation Cartel, or CJNG, seeks to expand its influence. According to local media, Manzo was killed by CJNG gunmen. Known for his outspoken criticism of the cartels and for challenging his own party, Morena, over what he viewed as inaction against organized crime, his assassination has triggered widespread outrage across the region. On November 3rd, protesters gathered in Morelia, the capital of Michoacán, where demonstrators attempted to forcibly enter the government palace, leading to at least 10 arrests. The following day, on November 4th, protesters set fire to the city hall in Apatzingan, southwest of Uruapan. Additional incidents of vandalism and arson were reported at construction sites and public transport facilities in Uruapan as unrest continued to spread. Now our team's assessment. Manzo's assassination is not the highest-profile killing in Mexico in recent years, and he was the seventh mayor to be murdered in Michoacán since 2022. The killing took place amid a sharp rise in violence across the state, almost certainly driven by the fragmentation of the Sinaloa cartel and the corresponding expansion of the Jalisco New Generation Cartel. The unrest following his death is likely fueled by Manzo's personal popularity and his reputation as a rare dissenting voice within Morena, openly critical of President Sheinbaum's approach to combating organized crime. There is a realistic possibility that the unusually large scale of the protests reflects broader pre-existing frustration with Sheinbaum's government, which has faced little organized opposition since she took office in 2024. Given the momentum of the current unrest and the heavy-handed police response to demonstrations in Morelia, further protests are likely in the short-term, including a large-scale march planned in Mexico City on November 15th. The fallout from Manzo's assassination is likely to prompt a strong response from the Mexican government, including the deployment of additional security forces in Michoacán and intensified raids targeting the CJNG and other local cartels. These actions will aim to restore control and reinforce the perception of state authority. President Sheinbaum has already shown a willingness to adopt a more assertive stance against organized crime, expanding military-led operations and increasing National Guard deployments in high-risk regions. This approach has resulted in a notable rise in arrests and drug seizures. However, Michoacán has become a major stronghold for the Jalisco New Generation Cartel, which frequently engages in armed confrontations with Mexican security forces. there is a realistic possibility that the CJNG will respond violently to any increased federal deployment in an effort to assert dominance and deter further incursions. The cartel has previously employed tactics such as ambushes, assassinations, arson attacks, and road blockades, methods it has repeatedly used in Michoacán, Jalisco, and Guanajuato to disrupt counter-cartel operations. Rival groups, including Los Viagras and Carteles Unidos, may also seek to exploit the additional pressure on the CJNG to expand their own territorial control, particularly in contested regions. This could lead to a further deterioration of the local security environment and a sustained escalation in violence. Still in the region, Washington is sending mixed messages over potential strikes in Venezuela. On October 31st, unverified sources claiming to have inside knowledge reported that the Trump administration was preparing imminent strikes on military installations inside Venezuela. The reports suggested that the strikes could take place within days or even hours, targeting facilities allegedly used by Tren de Aragua and the Cartel de los Soles, an informal Venezuelan criminal organization designated by the U.S. as a narco-terrorist group and reportedly led by senior members of the Venezuelan armed forces and President Nicolás Maduro himself. Other reports suggest that senior U.S. military officials have developed a range of potential options for action against Venezuela. These include kinetic strikes on military units protecting President Maduro, the seizure of oil fields and airfields, and special forces operations aimed at capturing or killing him. On the 3rd of November, President Trump downplayed the possibility of a U.S. war with Venezuela, but suggested that Maduro's days as the country's president were numbered. Now our intelligence team's assessment. The military options reportedly being considered by the United States appear designed to compel regime change and force Nicolás Maduro from power. Many of those options, including special forces operations or direct strikes on Venezuelan military installations, are high risk. They could result in U.S. casualties, wider escalation, civilian deaths, and significant domestic and international backlash. President Trump has publicly downplayed the risk of a U.S. war with Venezuela, even while asserting that Maduro's days in office are numbered. At the same time, Washington has deployed substantial naval, air, and intelligence assets to the Caribbean. These deployments have included strategic bombers, special forces elements, amphibious assault ships, destroyers, and acknowledged CIA operations, with the USS Gerald Ford Carrier Strike Group reportedly en route to the region. This combination of rhetorical minimization and visible force has created strategic ambiguity. That ambiguity is likely intended to increase pressure on the Maduro regime and complicate its decision-making. Yet, it also raises the risk of miscalculation and unintended escalation. If the United States is planning to strike Venezuela, it is unlikely to do so before the arrival of the Gerald Ford Carrier Strike Group. The group passed through the Strait of Gibraltar into the Atlantic Ocean on November 4th and is expected to be in theater by mid-November. The strike group includes more than 70 aircraft, several guided missile destroyers, and other escort vessels. Its presence would give the U.S. greater power projection, operational flexibility, and sustained reach. However, any direct strike on Venezuelan territory would almost certainly require additional legal justification. The Trump administration has reportedly informed Congress that the executive branch is arguing current operations do not constitute hostilities, since they involve remote strikes from international waters. This interpretation is expected to allow continued strikes on vessels in international waters without congressional approval. Yet, while the same logic could be stretched to justify limited strikes on land, it has already drawn significant bipartisan criticism and accusations of executive overreach. Legal challenges and domestic pressure may limit the administration's willingness to escalate to land strikes in the near term, unless it can secure clear legal justification and political support. As a result, the administration may choose instead to pursue a strategy of sustained isolation and economic pressure. It could use its strengthened military posture as a deterrent, while continuing its controversial strikes on Venezuela origin vessels suspected of narcotics smuggling. Now turning to Europe, the Middle East and Africa, where the battle for Pokrovsk in eastern Ukraine has grown increasingly critical as Russian forces edge closer to encircling the city. The strategically vital fight for Pokrovsk continues. On November 3rd, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky stated that although things are not easy for Ukrainian forces, Russia has achieved no success in Pokrovsk in recent days. In a post the following day, November 4th, Zelensky shared photographs of himself meeting soldiers in what was labeled the Dobropilya sector, part of the broader Pokrovsk axis. He wrote, "This is our country. We will certainly do our utmost to keep it Ukrainian." His remarks come amid some criticism from Ukrainian commentators over the continued allocation of substantial resources and manpower to defend Pokrovsk, despite the worsening situation on the ground. In a Hromadske article published on November 4th, a journalist deployed to the front line interviewed Ukrainian commanders and personnel defending Pokrovsk. One senior officer claimed that around 60% of the city is now under Russian control, describing the situation as bad. Another Ukrainian defender stated that forces on the forward positions are already basically in encirclement. Footage released on October 31st showed a Black Hawk helicopter landing Ukrainian special forces in the vicinity of the Pokrovsk axis. Meanwhile, the Russian offensive against Kupiansk in Kharkiv Oblast has continued. President Zelensky said that a clearance operation is underway and that Ukrainian forces will clear everything. In contrast, a Russian commander speaking to state-owned media expressed confidence that the city would be completely taken next week. Now, our team's assessment: Russian advances along the Pokrovsk axis have taken nearly 2 years to achieve, following the announced withdrawal of Ukrainian forces from Avdiivka in February 2024. It now appears unlikely that Ukrainian forces will be able to expel Russian troops who have entered the city. However, Ukrainian units are almost certainly continuing to impose significant costs on Moscow in both manpower and equipment. The Ukrainian 7th Rapid Response Corps has reported that around 11,000 Russian troops are currently storming Pokrovsk, a substantial concentration of force. A Ukrainian drone unit has also claimed that Russian forces are sending nearly 100 fire teams, each of up to 3 soldiers, into the city every day. A major challenge for Ukrainian defenders has been the impact of these deeper Russian advances on their ability to conduct first-person view drone strikes. Pilots and drone operators are increasingly exposed to direct firefights with enemy infantry and reconnaissance teams that have bypassed forward Ukrainian positions. As a result, Ukrainian forces have found it more difficult to target Russian troops as they approach the city. The penetration into Pokrovsk by small groups of Russian troops began in July 2025, advancing from the captured village of Zvirove. By late August and early September, reports indicated a significant redeployment of Russian forces to the Donetsk Oblast front lines from secondary axes such as Kursk and Sumy, including the movement of more elite formations. In earlier key battles, such as Avdiivka and Bakhmut, Ukrainian defenders who were ordered to withdraw faced intense pressure and suffered heavy losses. A similar reluctance to withdraw in a controlled manner from Pokrovsk could risk repeating that pattern. Ukrainian military command is likely weighing the potential costs and benefits of each option, whether to withdraw, potentially handing Russia only a Pyrrhic victory if done without major casualties, or to continue daring but costly operations, such as the likely failed Special Forces insertion in an effort to turn the tide. If Ukraine is ultimately forced to withdraw from Pokrovsk, it would likely set the stage for Russian forces to advance westward in an effort to isolate or encircle the Kramatorsk-Sloviansk agglomeration. This area represents the last major Ukrainian-held urban center in the Donbas and remains a critical economic hub. A Russian victory in Pokrovsk would also allow for an increased concentration of forces along the Kupiansk axis. While the battle for Kupiansk is generally considered less critical for Ukraine than Pokrovsk, the situation there remains highly unstable. The loss of Kupiansk would likely enable further Russian advances south along the Oskil River, a strategically significant natural buffer, with subsequent movements potentially placing the city of Izium within range of Russian indirect fire. It is highly likely that the ongoing Russian offensives are designed to create the conditions for a pincer movement, one advancing from the north along a potential Izium axis and another from the south through Pokrovsk. The aim would be to sever Ukraine's ground lines of communication into the Kramatorsk-Sloviansk area and achieve Moscow's long-standing objective of seizing the entire Donbas. However, achieving this goal is highly unlikely to occur quickly or without Russia sustaining extremely heavy casualties. Moving on to Mali, where worsening fuel crisis has prompted multiple Western governments to urge citizens to evacuate amid fears that future departures could become impossible. As of November 6th, Mali remains gripped by a fuel shortage caused by the ongoing blockade imposed by Jama'at Nusrat al-Islam wal-Muslimin, or JNM. Following the official statement from the Malian Crisis Coordination and Management Center on October 29th, which confirmed that certain fuel stations would be reserved for military use, authorities have since introduced additional restrictions and emergency measures in response to the crisis. On October 30th, an interministerial decree signed by 6 government departments mandated that all service stations in the country are now required to provide continuous service, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, to guarantee the supply of petroleum products to the population. The decree also prohibits the sale of fuel in jerry cans or other containers, except when used to power generators or machinery for professional or domestic purposes. In such cases, buyers must present documentation justifying the intended use of the fuel. Overnight on October 30th, a convoy of several dozen fuel tankers, escorted by Malian military personnel, reportedly entered the capital, Bamako. Now our assessment. Several Sahel analysts and observers from leading think tanks and international organizations have warned that the fuel blockade poses a potentially severe threat to Bamako. While JNIM is unlikely to have the immediate capacity to seize the capital by force, continued instability and economic decline could increase the risk of an internal coup and severely weaken the junta's grip on power. A senior member of Mali's former government, who claims to remain in close contact with senior figures in the armed forces, reported that a Malian colonel, who only months ago dismissed the possibility of Bamako falling to JNIM, has now admitted, "What we are seeing is the country collapse before our eyes." It is highly likely that the junta will prioritize its limited fuel reserves for military use, worsening shortages across civilian sectors. This will almost certainly deepen public frustration and fuel anti-junta sentiment, creating conditions that could strengthen JNIM's recruitment efforts and possibly trigger rare outbreaks of civil unrest. The earlier warning issued on October 28th by the U.S. Embassy in Mali, advising American citizens to leave while commercial flights remain available, has since been echoed by several other governments, including Italy, Australia, and Canada, all urging their nationals to depart the country. National advisories from Western governments are almost certainly urging their citizens to leave Mali as soon as possible, amid growing concern that safe evacuation could soon become impossible. Should the junta collapse, or Modibo Keita International Airport be forced to halt commercial operations due to severe fuel shortages, evacuation would carry significant risk. Most overland routes are already assessed as too dangerous to serve as viable alternatives. In Nigeria, U.S. President Donald Trump has threatened possible military action against Islamist militants. On October 31st, President Trump warned of potential intervention in response to what he described as the persecution of Christians by radical Islamists. Posting on Truth Social, he wrote, "The United States cannot stand by while such atrocities are happening in Nigeria and numerous other countries." Trump went on to instruct the Secretary of War to prepare for possible action, declaring that the United States would enter Nigeria guns a-blazing. Reports suggest that his comments implied the possibility of deploying ground forces. Trump's statement follows months of claims by campaigners and politicians in Washington that Islamist militants have systematically targeted Christians in Nigeria. The Nigerian government has rejected those assertions, describing them as a gross misrepresentation of reality. Officials have argued that terrorists attack all who reject their murderous ideology, Muslims, Christians, and those of no faith alike. However, Abuja has also indicated that it would welcome U.S. assistance in its counterinsurgency operations, provided that such support respects Nigeria's sovereignty and territorial integrity. Now, our intelligence assessment. Trump's post is almost certainly a reference to the ongoing jihadist insurgencies in northeastern Nigeria, where security forces continue to fight Boko Haram and its splinter group, the Islamic State West Africa Province, or ISWAP. Both groups have repeatedly targeted civilian communities in the region. Boko Haram has been responsible for numerous massacres and raids on villages near the tri-border area in Borno State, while ISWAP has more frequently focused its attacks on military outposts. Boko Haram has destroyed churches and explicitly targeted Christians on multiple occasions, including beheading those who refuse to convert to Islam. The most recent Boko Haram attacks on Christians took place on August 30th and 31st, 2025, when its fighters killed 8 people in 2 separate assaults in Borno State, 5 in Ngoshi village and 3 in Musa village. On November 3rd, ISWAP claimed responsibility for killing a Christian in the town of Shikara, near Chibok. However, this marks the group's first reported targeting of Christians in several months. The claim almost certainly aims to provoke a U.S. military response, which ISWAP could then exploit for propaganda purposes. While Nigeria's overall population is roughly evenly split between Christians and Muslims, the northern regions are predominantly Muslim. In Borno State, where about 85% of the population is Muslim, Christians make up only around 7%. Although Christians have frequently been targeted, Boko Haram has also attacked Muslims and non-religious individuals who oppose its ideology. The group considers anyone rejecting its strict interpretation of Sharia law to be an apostate. For example, on September 5, 2025, Boko Haram fighters indiscriminately killed at least 60 people in the village of Darul Jamal, which included returnees from an internally displaced persons camp. Trump's comments are highly likely to be perceived as an affront to Nigerian sovereignty. Opposition political figures are expected to use his remarks to criticize the government, potentially fueling anti-government sentiment and triggering public protests. A key insurgent tactic in Nigeria has long involved undermining security forces and delegitimizing the state. By eroding civilian confidence in the government's ability to maintain control, insurgents aim to win local support by presenting themselves as more capable of governing. In addition, attacks on civilians are often designed to provoke excessive responses from security forces, which can further alienate local communities. Trump's remarks are therefore highly likely to be exploited by jihadist propaganda, both to highlight the government's perceived weakness and to frame the United States as a hostile power bent on destroying Islam, a recurring theme in extremist narratives. Nigerian security forces are already conducting an airstrike campaign against Boko Haram and ISWAP under Operation Hadin Kai. The campaign has resulted in high levels of civilian collateral damage, largely because the militant groups are skilled at blending in with local populations, while the Nigerian Air Force relies heavily on spot reports, informants, and aerial surveillance. It is likely that Trump's comments are, in part, intended to pressure Nigeria into intensifying its counterinsurgency operations, a move that could further increase the risk of civilian casualties. However, greater military effort by Nigeria's security forces alone is unlikely to contain an insurgency that has persisted since 2009. There remains a realistic possibility that this situation could ultimately lead to direct U.S. military intervention. If the United States were to intervene militarily, it would likely mirror its counterinsurgency approach in Somalia, which has primarily involved missile strikes against insurgent strongholds. Should the U.S. military establish a more permanent presence in Nigeria, it could also use that position as a base for potential future operations across the wider Sahel region, particularly in Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, where military juntas continue to struggle against persistent jihadist insurgencies. Now in Central Africa, Cameroon's opposition leader has called for nationwide ghost towns following deadly post-election unrest. According to the United Nations, at least 48 people have been killed in protests that erupted in support of Issa Chiroma Bakary, who unilaterally declared victory in the October 12 presidential election. The most recent and most intense wave of unrest occurred between October 26th and 30th, following weeks of sporadic clashes leading up to the official announcement of results. Most of the reported deaths took place in and around Douala, where security forces allegedly beat and shot protesters. Cameroon's Interior Minister, Paul Atanga Nji, has announced that Issa Chiroma Bakary will face legal action over the unrest, accusing him of inciting violent post-election demonstrations. Bakary, however, has vowed to continue his fight. On October 30th, he reported that his personal cook and a family member had been detained by security forces. The following day, he claimed that soldiers loyal to him had escorted him to a secure location for his protection. On October 31st, Bakary called for 3 days of nationwide ghost towns aimed at paralyzing the economy. In a video posted on social media, he urged supporters to close their businesses, remain at home, and suspend all economic activity in what he described as a peaceful paralysis from November 3rd to 5th. Images circulating on social media show that many businesses have closed across several Cameroonian cities, including Douala and Yaoundé. On November 3rd, protests erupted in Banyo following a visit by the prefect, during which protesters set fire to the official's home and the local political party headquarters. President Paul Biya is expected to be sworn in by November 9th, with reports suggesting that the ceremony will take place on November 6th in Yaoundé. Meanwhile, unconfirmed reports claim that a parallel swearing-in for Issa Chiroma Bakary is planned for the same day. Other accounts, however, suggest that Bakary has already fled across the border into Adamawa State, Nigeria. Now, our team's assessment. If the dual swearing-in ceremonies go ahead, further unrest is highly likely, particularly in Yaoundé and Douala. Holding a parallel ceremony would almost certainly signal that Issa Chiroma Bakary intends to lead the protest movement against the government, despite the high likelihood of his arrest. There is a realistic possibility that Bakary will call for additional waves of protest, which would likely prolong civil unrest and increase pressure on the government through more coordinated action. Security forces are highly likely to respond with force, a move that could further inflame tensions and intensify demonstrations across major cities. The imposition of ghost towns is a well-established tactic in Cameroon's Anglophone regions. It involves a large-scale general strike that shuts down economic, social, and public life, leaving streets deserted, businesses and schools closed, and transport suspended. The practice occurs every Monday in Bamenda, the largest city in the northwest and southwest Anglophone regions. Residents who defy the shutdown risk being attacked, kidnapped, or shot. These ghost town actions have severely damaged the local economy, leading to widespread job losses as employers struggle to pay salaries and investors withdraw from the Anglophone areas. There is a realistic possibility that Issa Chiroma Bakary will announce further waves of such shutdowns. This would likely deal a serious blow to Cameroon's economy, but it could also allow citizens to express dissent without directly confronting security forces, enabling protest while reducing the immediate risk to life. And in Tanzania, protests have subsided after the government lifted curfews and restored internet access. Civil unrest erupted across major cities between October 29th and 31st, after the ruling CCM party excluded several major opposition groups from participating in the general election held on October 29th. During the demonstrations, protesters clashed with security forces, prompting the authorities to impose both a curfew and a nationwide internet shutdown. The unrest caused major disruptions to air travel and public transport, leaving many tourists stranded at airports and in Zanzibar. Death toll estimates from the unrest vary widely. The United Nations has confirmed at least 10 fatalities, while Amnesty International reports more than 100. Opposition sources claim the number could be as high as 1,000. Agence France-Presse cited a security source who reported figures of over 500 dead, possibly 700 to 800 across the whole country. No major demonstrations have taken place since October 31st. Over the weekend, security forces effectively locked down major cities to prevent any renewed protests. On November 1st, incumbent President Samia Suluhu Hassan was declared the winner of Tanzania's general election, securing 97.66% of the vote, with an official turnout of 87%. This result came despite observers reporting that many polling stations appeared largely empty on election day. The swearing-in ceremony took place at a military parade ground in Dodoma, rather than the usual stadium, and was closed to the public. During the event, President Hassan ordered authorities to ensure that life across the country returned to normal immediately. The main opposition party has rejected the results and called for a new election. Following President Hassan's swearing in, a government spokesperson announced that social and economic activities would resume as normal on November 4th. After the statement, the curfew was lifted and internet access was officially restored. However, NetBlocks has reported that significant restrictions remain in place across multiple social media and messaging platforms. Before the lifting of internet restrictions, Tanzanian police circulated a text message on November 3rd warning the public to avoid sharing photos or videos that cause distress or degrade someone's dignity. The message added that doing so would be treated as a criminal offense, and that strict legal action would be taken against anyone found in violation. Despite these warnings, many Tanzanians continue to share footage of the protests on social media. Several images and videos appear to show security forces using live ammunition against demonstrators. Viral Scout Management, a sports management consultancy, posted on X that 7 young football players it represented, aged between 15 and 21, were signed by a major European club, 22, were shot and killed in their homes during the unrest. Now, our assessment, footage and eyewitness accounts showing security forces using deadly force are highly likely to deepen anti-government sentiment. There is a realistic possibility that this could trigger further civil unrest across the country. Prices of food, fuel, and other essential goods have doubled or even tripled in many areas, while some supermarkets are reporting shortages due to the closure of Dar es Salaam port. Public hospitals have also reported dwindling medical supplies. The rising cost of living is likely to compound public frustration with the government's authoritarian tendencies and allegations of electoral manipulation. However, large-scale protests in Tanzania are generally rare, and the security forces' severe response, including the widespread use of live ammunition, is likely to deter many from taking part in further demonstrations. The swift swearing-in of President Hassan has also likely created a sense of defeatism among protesters. With many opposition figures already arrested, and given the government's strong control over the judiciary, there appears to be no viable path to overturn the election results. Any renewed demonstrations would almost certainly face a harsh response from security forces, who are unlikely to hesitate in using lethal force to suppress dissent. Finally, in Asia-Pacific, Typhoon Kalmaegi has devastated parts of the central Philippines before striking Vietnam, where widespread flooding has already left dozens dead. Typhoon Kalmaegi, known locally in the Philippines as Typhoon Tino, made landfall in the eastern Visayas region on November 3rd. The storm brought heavy rainfall and severe flooding as it moved across the Visayas Islands, with Cebu province among the hardest hit. At least 114 deaths have been reported, most of them on Cebu Island. Both Guyuan town in eastern Samar and Cebu province have declared a state of calamity due to the extensive flooding and damage. Around 400,000 people were displaced by the storm following large-scale anticipatory evacuations, and dozens remain missing. As of November 6th, Typhoon Kalmaegi was expected to make landfall imminently in central Vietnam, bringing sustained winds of up to 200 kilometers per hour. Vietnam has already suffered extensive flooding in recent days, with at least 40 fatalities reported. In preparation for the typhoon's arrival, authorities have suspended operations at 6 airports and issued urgent evacuation orders for residents in high-risk areas. Now our team's assessment. The area of the Philippines most severely affected by Typhoon Kalmaegi was still recovering from a magnitude 6.9 earthquake on September 30th, which killed at least 79 people. In addition, the country was already dealing with the aftermath of 2 previous storms. Super Typhoon Ragasa, known locally as Nando, and Typhoon Bualoy, known locally as Opong, which struck in quick succession before Kalmaegi's arrival. The Philippines typically experiences around 20 storms and typhoons each year. With the arrival of Kalmaegi, the disaster-prone archipelago has already reached that number in 2025. A weather specialist from Pagasa has indicated that a further 3 to 5 storms are expected before the end of the year. Disaster resilience, which encompasses preparedness measures, infrastructure quality, urban planning, and emergency response capacity, plays a critical role in determining the severity of a natural disaster's impact. Given its combination of extreme exposure to environmental hazards such as earthquakes and tropical storms, and its comparatively weak disaster resilience, the Philippines is consistently ranked among the most vulnerable countries in the world to natural disasters. The most effective way to prevent mass casualties during an incoming tropical cyclone is almost certainly through the mandatory evacuation of populations in areas expected to face severe impact. In anticipation of Typhoon Kalmaegi, authorities preemptively relocated nearly 400,000 people. However, Cebu's governor, Pamela Baracuatro, described the impact of the disaster as unprecedented. Multiple reports indicate that the scale of flooding across Cebu province, almost certainly caused by the overflowing of numerous rivers, has completely overwhelmed emergency response efforts. The severe flooding caused by Typhoon Kalmaegi is likely to further energize the nationwide protest movement against corruption in disaster resilience projects. The movement began in response to allegations of widespread mismanagement and corruption within government flood management initiatives. Protests have been held several times each week since September. One of the largest took place on September 21st, when an estimated 60,000 people joined demonstrations across Metro Manila. In Vietnam, the imminent landfall of Typhoon Kalmaegi is highly likely to worsen the severe flooding that has affected central parts of the country since at least October 27th. The cities of Da Nang, Quang Ngai, Hue, and the popular tourist destination of Hoi An have been particularly hard hit. The ongoing floods were initially caused by intense monsoon rains and tropical depression Fengshen. Kalmaegi is forecast to make landfall just south of Da Nang, directly over the areas already experiencing the heaviest flooding. Infrastructure in the region has been badly damaged, leaving several rural communities isolated. This situation is highly likely to deteriorate further once the typhoon makes landfall. Typhoon Kalmaegi's arrival in central Vietnam therefore poses a severe threat to life in the most vulnerable areas. That concludes this week's Global Intelligence Briefing. These updates are part of our Global Intelligence subscription, which includes weekly reports, in-depth briefings, and live Q&A sessions with our experts. To learn more, visit solisglobal.com. Thank you for listening.